Good morning. Let me introduce myself. So my name is Blaine Charette, and I'm a professor of biblical studies at Northwest University in Kirkland. And it's always a privilege for me to preach here or teach here at Northwest. Okay, yeah. It was a privilege to teach at Northwest University, but it's always a privilege to speak here at Image Church, okay? I enjoy the fellowship here. I enjoy being part of this community, and I appreciate the fact that I'm able to kind of share my giftings with the community, okay? Now, to go back a couple of weeks, last time I spoke, we were looking at John's Gospel, and we're going to continue to look at John's Gospel. And we're looking at that question of what is life, okay? And when I introduced that, I noted that it's helpful for us to think of the Christian faith as, in some terms, a philosophy, okay? If you think of the word philosophy, simply the love of wisdom. And what we're talking about is the love of God's wisdom. Now, obviously, there's a difference between human wisdom and God's wisdom, but what we believe is God's wisdom, okay? And it's helpful, again, to think of the Christian faith as a wisdom tradition. You know, far too often we think of Christianity as a religion, but as we know, religions aren't too popular in the modern world, okay? And there's no reason why we need to think of the Christian faith in that way anyways, because if you look at the New Testament, if you look at the early Christians, they're not positioning themselves over against Hellenistic religion, over against the religions that are current there in the first century. They just see this as a bunch of idolatry that has nothing to do with what they're about. But what you do find so often in early Christianity and in the New Testament is this positioning of the Christian faith over against the philosophical traditions that were current, okay? And we see this to great effect in John's Gospel. Think of the very opening of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word. I mean, everybody in the first century would recognize that as a philosophical statement. And he's doing that intentionally. It's a hook. Because again, the most popular philosophy at that time is Stoicism, and this term, the logos, the word, or just the logos, this kind of rational principle that they saw as permeating the universe, that's central to their belief system. So John recognizes that a way I can get people's attention is by, again, starting with this concept of word. In the beginning was the Word. And then what would blow their minds is when you get a little bit later in the prologue, and the Word became flesh. The Word became a human and lived among us, okay? And then you're off to the races in John's Gospel, okay? Because you've got this Word, and now we're introduced to this figure of Jesus, who is the incarnate Word of God, and Jesus now begins to speak words, okay? Another very interesting thing about John's Gospel is the very first words out of Jesus' mouth in John's Gospel are, "What are you looking for?" You have these disciples of John the Baptist, and John's Gospel informs us that the first followers of Jesus, many of the first followers of Jesus had begun as disciples of John the Baptist. But then John the Baptist makes the famous announcement, "Behold the Lamb of God." And he's essentially directing his disciples to this one Jesus. And so these two disciples of John begin to follow Jesus, and Jesus, it doesn't engage in any small talk with them, it just gets to the point. He cuts to the chase. What are you looking for? Or you could almost translate that, what do you want? Which again, basic, fundamental question, right? And that's why it'd be helpful for us to think of the Christian faith, especially in terms of our evangelism, to think of the Christian faith as a wisdom tradition, because people may be dead to religion. They may be just cold about that. But these questions never lose their significance, right? Anyone who's breathing is every day asking those questions. Why am I here? What is life all about? What am I looking for? What's the purpose? What should be my purpose in life? And so that's how Jesus chooses to open his dialogue. And of course, as John writes this question, it pops out of the text. As you're reading John's gospel, this is the first question that Jesus is asking you as the reader of John's gospel. What are you looking for? Okay, but what I want to focus on today is another question. Why do you believe? Okay. Because again, oftentimes John's gospel is referred to as the gospel of belief, because as we'll see, belief language is just all over the place in John's gospel. Okay. And again, a branch of philosophy is what we call epistemology, okay? And you won't be tested on that, okay? But epistemology, and you'll see why I want to use that term, because the language of pisteuo and pistis, this language of faith, this language of belief, is all over the place. But it's important to recognize that part of philosophy is epistemology, which is basically what? How do we come to know things? And how do we evaluate what we know? How do we assess, is this true or is this false, right? Because obviously, we don't want to be going down the wrong directions, in life. We want to make sure that what we believe is true, okay? Because again, our faith needs to be rooted in what is real, what is truthful, what is reality. So again, this becomes a fundamental question in John's gospel is, why do you believe? On what is your faith or your knowledge or your belief system based? Okay. Now, what you find throughout the Bible, throughout the scriptures, is there's two major ways in which God communicates to us, or that he reveals himself to us. Okay, so these are the two kind of basic ways that knowledge or information comes to us from God. God speaks and God acts. And you see this throughout the Bible, that kind of dual aspect of revelation. God communicates through his words, and God communicates through his actions. Or oftentimes in the Old Testament, it's these mighty deeds of God. Okay. And again, if you think of we as humans, we're the receivers of this revelation. When we think of how we receive information, it's primarily what? Through the ear and through the eye, right? So that's why there's so much emphasis in the Bible when we're looking at from the human point of view, is we need to make sure we have ears to hear and eyes to see so we don't miss out on this, okay, on what God is wanting to communicate. So we're going to be looking again at John's gospel, and what you're going to see is that word, and particularly in John, sign, become extremely important to how Jesus reveals the truth about God. Okay, so again, in the beginning was the Word, right? And the Word begins to speak. But what you'll find in the public ministry of Jesus, as that's described in John's gospel, and the public ministry of Jesus basically goes from about the end of chapter 1 to the end of chapter 12. But it's what you see there is a combination of signs that Jesus performs. Altogether, there's these 7 major signs or miracles that he performs. But then what you have between these signs are these conversations or dialogues or discourses, they're sometimes described as, where Jesus is now speaking. Okay, so, and this is true even in all 4 Gospels, you see this, right? So Jesus recognizes that as he's communicating, but both through his words and through his actions, right? So you want to be careful that when we think of Jesus, don't think of him as a teacher who happens to do miracles, or don't think of him as a miracle worker who happens to teach. Both of those things are together, okay? And when we look at Paul's ministry, we would see that, we'll come back to John, but when we look at Paul's ministry, we see something very similar. Let's look at the beginning of 1 Thessalonians and the beginning of, or near the beginning of 1 Corinthians. But note what he says to the Thessalonian church. We know, brothers and sisters, beloved by God, that he has chosen you because our gospel came to you not in word, not in logos alone, but also in power. Dunamis is this Greek word. In power and in the Holy Spirit and with full assurance. So he's saying to them, when I came to you to bring the gospel, again, because Paul wants to imitate Christ, right? So when he comes, he recognizes that it's not just a word that he brings, but it's also power and the demonstrations of God's Spirit, right? Because people need to know that this gospel has power to it. It's not just something to hear and listen to. Why would anyone want to listen if it's not transformative? And so Paul, one way we should think of this is when we proclaim the gospel, we don't want to do it with one hand tied behind our back. If the way we present the gospel is word alone, well, that might achieve some purpose, but that's not the full gospel. Or likewise, you don't want to communicate the gospel where it's simply miracles and simply signs and wonders without teaching, because that's not a healthy representation of the gospel either. It's two hands, the word and the power of God. That's what is necessary for the gospel to go forward. Look at what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 2. When I came to you, brothers and sisters, I claim declaring to you the mystery of God, not with exalted words, okay? And what do you think? Again, the Corinthians, this is a Greek city, and very much people are impressed with what? Rhetoric and oratory, right? So, and a lot of the again, that's a branch of philosophy is rhetoric, like how to be persuasive in your speech, how to communicate very effectively. But Paul doesn't want that to be what the faith of the Corinthians relies on, right? So he eschews all of that because he's decided that when he comes among them, he wants to know nothing except Jesus Christ and him crucified. Right? In other words, the gospel message for Paul doesn't need any varnish on it. It doesn't need to be gilded. He strips it right down to what is the basic word of the gospel: Christ crucified. And that's all he wants to know when he comes to the Corinthians. And so he says, so I came to you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling, and my word and proclamation were made not with persuasive words of wisdom, but with a demonstration of spirit and power, in order that your faith, and see pistis there, epistemology, right? So it's all rooted in that language there, so that your pistis, your faith, would not be rooted in human wisdom, but in the power of God. And again, Paul's going to go on to say that there is a wisdom of God. In fact, the cross, which is central to Paul's message, is in fact what? God's wisdom. It may seem like foolishness to humans, but it is the wisdom of God. Okay, so all that to say that what is essential to the proclamation of the gospel is both word and power. Okay, so going back to John's gospel, what we see, and what we'll just basically give kind of a review of, is where in John we see people come to belief in Jesus because of signs, okay? So in 2:11, you've got the first of his signs, turning the water into wine at the wedding at Cana. Jesus did this, the first of his signs in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory. And note this, his disciples believed, pisteuo, the verbal form of that. His disciples believed in him when they see the sign that he had performed. Later in that chapter, when Jesus was in Jerusalem during the Passover festival, many believed in his name because they saw the signs that he was doing. In chapter 3, Nicodemus came to Jesus at night, and what does he say to him? Rabbi, we know, and again, this kind of epistemological language, this knowledge. Nicodemus isn't quite a believer at this point, but he knows that you are a teacher who has come from God. Why? Because no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. Okay, and then moving a little bit further, 731, now many in the crowd believed in Jesus and were saying, when the Christ comes, will he do more signs than this man has done? And then note at the very end, well, not the very end, but one of the concluding portions of John's gospel, note how John sums up this gospel. Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you might have life in his name. So for John, signs are an essential part of belief, okay? It's important for us to see what Jesus has done, because that's part of the message. You know, it's important to recognize that even in the Old Testament, you have this language of sign, and how the ancient Hebrews understood sign is as a visible word. Okay, so you have an auditory word, but a sign becomes a visible word. And so Jesus is communicating through these miracles that he performs. And John sees that as an essential part of the revelation that comes through Jesus. Okay. But at the same time, what's interesting in John's gospel is you have this rebuke that Jesus will oftentimes issue to those who depend on signs to believe. So it's kind of an interesting kind of twist to things. John's not walking away from signs, because as we noted, when he concludes the gospel, these are written that you might believe, okay? But at the same time, he definitely wants us to put signs in a proper context, okay? So going back to chapter 2, we read the first part of this earlier, but let's go back and look at this again. When he was in Jerusalem during the Passover festival, many believed in his name because they saw the signs that he was doing. But Jesus himself, you've got this interesting play on words in the Greek text, which is hard to communicate in English. But literally what it's saying here is Jesus did not believe in their belief. He sees something insincere in their belief, right? So it's interesting how you've got the two uses of pisteuo there. They believe in him. Jesus, not so sure whether he believes. You know, think of the language of trust. He doesn't trust them. He doesn't trust their belief. He feels there's something suspect, something insincere about that belief. And we'll see why as we work through this. But before we leave that statement, he didn't entrust himself to them because he knew, you've got gnosko, this language of knowledge, again, another one of these epistemological terms. Because Jesus knew what humans are like, he needed no one to testify about human nature, for he himself knew what it was to be human. Again, the incarnation, there's nothing about humans that Jesus doesn't understand and know, right? He knows how humans operate. And this is why he's taking a step back when he sees them, on the one hand, expressing belief, but again, he's not so sure, okay? In 448, and we'll come back to this passage a bit later, then Jesus said to him, this is this royal official who comes to Jesus because his son is at the point of death. And so he wants Jesus to come down and heal his son. And what does Jesus say in response to that request? He says, unless you, but in Greek this is a plural you. In English, part of the reason why I say in the South I say you all is, or what do we, you guys. I guess what we say is you guys, right? So we have to find some way of making it plural, because typically when we say you, we just think of an individual, right? In Greek, though, of course, you've got the plural, you. And it's important to recognize here, even though he's addressing this man's question, he's speaking to the crowd. He's speaking to the people of Galilee. And he's saying to them, unless you see signs and wonders, you do not believe. So you can see where there's a certain kind of impatience that is emerging with Jesus with respect to signs. Moving further into chapter 6, what is preceded what Jesus is going to say here is the feeding of the 5,000. Again, one of the major signs of John's gospel, where Jesus feeds the multitude there in the wilderness. Okay. And later, he goes over to the other side of the Red Sea, and the crowd has run across to meet him there. And note what Jesus says when he sees the crowds chasing after him. He says, very truly I tell you, you're looking for me not because you saw signs, but because you ate the bread and were satisfied, right? And what does he mean by not because you saw this, not because you truly are interested in what this sign is about? Because keep in mind, the word sign itself means a pointer. It's pointing, every one of these miracles is pointing to something profound, something true, something real about who Jesus is. These signs are there to provoke questions about these big issues. Who is this guy that does these signs? What does this say about where we are right now in history, right? Like, what is God doing right now through Jesus? These are the kinds of questions. All they're interested in is the food. And this is what Jesus makes it. Like with a dog, with a dog, if you point to something with the dog, where does their nose go? Your finger, right? So they don't understand that, no, I'm not drawing your, but we're like dogs in that sense. We have this tendency, when God is pointing through something, he's pointing to a deeper, more profound reality, we get preoccupied with God's finger, right? We're like the dog looking at the finger rather than where we want the dog's attention to be, okay? And that's part of human nature. And that's what Jesus has to wrestle with. He's not going to back away from doing these signs, because again, they're an important part of what he needs to reveal. But he does become frustrated with people that they are just too focused on the sign and not on what the sign is about. They're failing to see what the sign is really about, okay? And then look at near the very end of the gospel, Jesus said to Thomas, and you're probably familiar with the story, Thomas isn't there when Jesus first appears after he's been raised from the dead. Thomas isn't there with the other disciples, and he doesn't believe it. And he says, well, I'll only believe it when I can what? See his wounds and touch his wounds. So Jesus shows up, and he says to Thomas, put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Be not unbelieving, pistos, but believing, pistos. Thomas answered and said to him, my Lord and my God. And Jesus said to him, have you believed because you've seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed. Okay. So again, we don't want to, part of the problem with we as humans is we get too preoccupied with the sign and not what that sign is about. Or to put it another way, we get too preoccupied with the gift and not think about the giver. And that's one of the real problems, right? I mean, I'm a charismatic Christian. You think of the word charismatic, it comes from the Greek word for gifts. So a charismatic Christian is a Christian who is what? Open to the gifts of God. We recognize that God is a God of power, and God gives spiritual gifts, and he wants to pour out spiritual giftings upon his people, right? But at the same time, we want to make sure that we don't become too focused on the gift and not the giver. Because then we're not seeing signs at that point. We're simply relishing the gift. We would have a real problem. If you were a man, you'd have a real problem if you bought an engagement ring. An engagement ring's sort of a sign of something, isn't it? It's a sign of commitment, love, that kind of thing. If you are getting serious with a woman and you buy her a ring, and then all of a sudden that's what she's focused on, that's what she's preoccupied. She doesn't want to date you anymore because she just wants to stay at home and look at her ring, right? I mean, what would you think? You would think, boy, there's something really weird about that. Sadly, far too often that happens in charismatic circles. People become too focused on the gift and not anymore thinking in terms. The gift is only good as it draws us closer to the giver. That's the purpose of the gift. I remember hearing a testimony, just to show how we can easily fall into this trap. I remember hearing a testimony of a guy. He became a Christian. He had this horrible drug habit, and then he was selling drugs to support his drug habit, and he was doing all other kinds of things. So he ends up getting in prison. But he becomes a believer shortly after he enters into prison. But he's in the California penitentiary system. He's going through withdrawals. But as a new Christian, all he did, he would just go to this chapel that was in the prison, and he would just lay on the floor in this chapel. And every time he would go in there, it was like the presence of God came upon him like this warm blanket, and he would just kind of luxuriate in the presence of God, right? And this went on for like several weeks. And then as he would go into the chapel, he wouldn't have that same feeling. And he began to kind of doubt his faith. Like, am I getting cold towards God? Or maybe I've done something and God's kind of departing from me. And then what God said to him is, no, I gave you needed that as you were going through withdrawals. But now you're stronger, and I'm going to meet with you in other ways, right? And so he had this profound experience. You could say that was a sign, this warmth, this energizing power he felt when he initially would go into that chapel. He doesn't feel that after several weeks, but why? Because God's now taking him into a next level of knowledge with him, right? If I can share a personal testimony, I remember when I was 17, I went through this period of a few months where I was just super anxious because I knew I was coming close to graduating from high school. I had no idea what I was going to be doing out of high school. And I remember just being really I was a Christian, but just really being anxious about what my next steps were going to be. And the church I was going to at the time, on Sunday evenings, there would always be like an altar time after the service. So one Sunday evening, I just went up and I just started praying just by myself. And all of a sudden, this spirit of hilarity came over me, where I just started kind of laughing uncontrollably. And people just sort of left me alone, okay? Some of my friends thought this was kind of odd, but and I don't even know how long, the way you could describe it as in some kind of if you're going to describe it in psychological terms, as in some kind of ecstatic spiritual state for I don't know how long, half hour, 45 minutes, an hour. And then I come out of it, and what's interesting is the anxiety went away. God, it's not like I came out of that experience as some blind, God didn't all of a sudden say, you're going to become a Bible professor. That didn't happen. It's 4 years later before that realization came in. But the important thing was that experience was super cathartic, is exactly what I need in that moment. The anxiety never returned. It's not as though God answers, not, God again, he didn't give me some blinding revelation of what my life's going to look like. But what was important is he took away that anxiety. And it never ever returned. Okay? I knew, it's like God saying, I've got this, you don't need to worry about this, right? But then fast forward about 20 years, I begin to hear reports from, that Toronto blessing, where the Spirit would come upon people at the Toronto Airport Vineyard Church just outside of Toronto. And the phenomenon was this laughing kind of thing. And I remember at the time thinking, that's interesting because I had that experience. But then what began to trouble me, and this is sort of what sometimes troubles me about the charismatic movement, is they begin to package it and sell it and turn it into this marketable kind of experience. And then it migrates to Brownsville, it migrates to different kinds of places. And I remember at the time, and by then I am a Bible professor, and what I'm thinking is, God doesn't want us to just repeat these experiences. Like that experience, and I don't doubt that some people there, that was a genuine kind of thing, but it's the trying to repeat. There's a problem with that, because we're getting too focused then on the sign and not on God, because God's goal in our lives is to break us out of that a kind of faith that's rooted only in sign or experience to something more profound, something deeper. Okay. And look how John ends the public ministry of Jesus, okay? So now we're as I noted before, the public ministry of Jesus basically goes from end of chapter 1 to chapter 12, basically. And much of chapter 12 is basically a summary of things, okay? And, but note John's words here. Even though Jesus had done so many signs in their presence, they did not believe in him. Okay. In order that the words spoken by Isaiah the prophet might be fulfilled, Lord, who has believed our message? To whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Therefore, they were not able to believe, because Isaiah also said, he's blinded their eyes, hardened their heart, so that they might not see with their eyes and understand with their heart and turn so that I would heal them. Okay. What's interesting here is this Isaiah 6, 9 to 10 passage, which is quoted there at the very end. That's one of the most quoted passages in the Gospels from Isaiah. And Isaiah is quoted all over the place in the Gospels, but particularly this passage becomes key, and also the book of Acts. The book of Acts actually ends with an extended quotation. But what's interesting here is every other time Isaiah 6 is quoted in the New Testament, it's what? Eyes, ears, and heart. God shuts their eyes, closes their ears, hardens their heart. Okay. Isaiah is talking about his own generation. Jesus is talking about his generation. Paul at the end of Acts is talking about his generation, and we could talk about our generation, right? Because far too often people just aren't seeing. But what's interesting about John is John leaves out the ears, right? And this tells us something interesting about John's perspective. The remedy, the signs can actually have the effect, they can actually have this negative effect of bringing out a blinding. Right? That's why we want to make sure our faith is not dependent on that and rooted in that. But it's interesting that John purposely doesn't have the hearing, right? Because as we'll see in John, that becomes crucial. Okay, so let's, so a transition passage, which I think holds a lot of keys to helping us understand what needs to be the basis of my belief, is going back to chapter 4 with that royal official, okay? So Jesus came again to Cana in Galilee where he made the water wine, and there was a royal official whose son was ill in Capernaum. When the man heard that Jesus had come from Judea to Galilee, he went and asked him to come down and heal his son, for he was about to die. Then Jesus said to him, and we just looked at this before, unless you see signs and wonders, you do not believe. The official said to him, Lord, come down before my child dies. And note this, Jesus said to him, go, your son lives. And note the next phrase, the man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him and went. Now, as he was going down, his servants met him and told him that his child lives. Then he inquired about the hour when he recovered, and they said to him, yesterday at 1 p.m, the fever left him. And then the father knew that this was the hour when Jesus had said to him, your son lives. So he believed along with his whole household. This was the second sign that Jesus did after coming from Judea to Galilee. Okay, but note this, in some respects, this is sort of a transition passage because Jesus has already expressed frustration with those who believe just because of signs. But it's interesting the test he gives to this guy. What? He simply gives him a word. Your son lives. And the man now has to believe on that. He wants Jesus to come to Capernaum. He wants to witness. He wants to see Jesus' power. What Jesus, in effect, is saying to him, trust my word on this. Okay. And as the man believes that, everything falls into place. So we see where, and what we're talking about here is that more mature kind of faith that Jesus is talking about when he's talking to Thomas, okay, where we simply have to believe even when we don't see evidence of things, okay. Okay, another passage we'll look at related to this, and this is after that bread of life. Again, you've got the miracle of the, like Sarah last week, it's like all of a sudden that clock just disappears. It's sort of it's like a time lapse thing. You look up and you got a lot of time. Next thing you look, it's in the red. But I won't keep you much longer. But again, chapter 6, the feeding of the 5,000. And then after that, Jesus gives the famous bread of life teaching. Right? Because again, what's this sign about? It's not about eating food. It's not the fact that Jesus isn't a magician at your beck and call that, we need dinner and Jesus shows up and provides dinner. It's all pointing to what? These deeper realities of what he has come to give. He is this bread of life, right? But when many of his disciples heard this teaching, this bread of life teaching, they said, this word is hard. Who can hear it? Jesus, knowing that the disciples were complaining about it, said to them, does this offend you? Then what if you were to see the Son of Man, not the Son of Many, that should be Son of Man, Son of Man ascending to where he was before? It is the Spirit that gives life. The flesh offers no benefit. The words that I've spoken to you, note this, are spirit and life. But among you are some who do not believe. For from the beginning, Jesus knew who are the ones that did not believe and who was the one that would betray him. And he said, for this reason I've told you that no one is able to come to me unless it is given to him from the Father. And note this, as a result of this, many of his disciples turned and no longer walked with him. Okay. Just again, another philosophical side note. It's interesting that language that is used here. They stopped walking with Jesus. Again, in the Greek philosophical tradition, that peripatetic, think of Aristotle, he starts that whole peripatetic tradition of walking. Teachers would walk with their disciples, right? And that's how the teaching was conducted. Unlike rabbis who tended to just teach in synagogues, Jesus, as we see, he's constantly walking around with his disciples. But what's interesting here is many of his disciples no longer walked with him. they've left the school of Jesus, right? They're no longer interested in learning from Jesus. Why? Because his word is too difficult. His word is too hard, okay? But then Jesus asked the 12, do you also want to go away? And Simon Peter answers and says, Lord, to whom can we go? You have the words of eternal life. We've come to believe and know that you are the Holy One of God. And note that epistemological statement at the end there. We've come to believe and to know that you are the Holy One of God. Peter recognizes, and it's not that Peter's fully understanding what Jesus is saying either. The word's probably hard for him, but he recognizes, I have no choice but to stick with this, because apart from Jesus, there is no life, okay? Apart from Jesus, my life has no purpose and meaning. So where else am I going to go, okay? Great statement of faith, okay? But note that it's the word. Jesus' words are spirit and life, okay? And then one last thing we'll look at is, for Jesus, discipleship is remaining in the word. So Jesus said to those Jews who believed in him, if you remain, and you could, again, another very important word in John's gospel, sometimes translated abide or continue, but if you continue, if you remain in my word, then you are truly my disciple, and you will know the truth, and the truth will free you. But what's important here is, what does it mean to remain in the word? Well, keep in mind that Jesus himself is the word, right? We're talking about a relational thing here, because again, the Bible can be just words on the page. The Bible, a lot of people read the Bible and it still kind of leaves them cold. You have to read the Bible in such a way where you're inviting that Spirit of Christ to come alive to you. And you want to remain in that. And you want to keep then reading the Bible in this nourishing kind of way, or feeding upon that teaching of Jesus, so that that word, who is Jesus himself, can be real in your life. Okay, that's what it means to remain in his words. And what's the result of that? You will know the truth. And here again, even in John's gospel, the truth is not an abstraction. Think of John 14:6. I am the way, the truth, and the life. He is the embodiment of truth, right? And then as a result of that, we are what? Free. Okay. Our lives in this world, as we talked about last time, our lives in this world are so much bondage. It's a life of slavery, really. It's not freedom. But as we take on board the words of Jesus, as we attend to his teaching, and as we hear those words, but they draw us closer to that one who is the word, the one who is truth, we come to know that life that sets us free. Let's close in a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for your word, and we thank you that there is spirit and life in what is communicated through your word. And again, we don't want to be dismissive of the sign and the miraculous, because there are people here right now who do need a miracle in their lives. And we know that you are a God of power. And I just pray that those who need that profound touch in your life right now, whether it be encouragement or some other form of miracle in their life, a healing, a financial problem, whatever it might be, I just pray that as they remain in the Word, it would give them that confidence to expect that miracle from you and have faith. And just as the royal official, they would just act on that faith that you are there with them, you've got their back, and you've already heard their request. But for those, and for all of us too, we need to know your power in our lives, but help us to become mature in our understanding of your word. Help us to fall in love with that communication that comes to us through you, knowing that that communication always draws us back into deeper relationship with you, because we do want to be those who are in love with the giver, those who are in love with the one whom the signs point to. We ask all this in the name of Jesus. Amen.